Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Clarifying Catholicism. Ordinarily, we explore theological topics, but in this series, we investigate the writings of, in my opinion, the most important little-known philosopher of the 20th century, Xavier Zubiri. This is not a theological series at all whatsoever. However, if you want to do good theology, you'll need a good philosophical backbone first. So if you want to check out the rest of the episodes in this series, check the link in the description. Without further ado, on to the show. Last episode we talked all about truth, and today we're going to go more in depth on the topic. But first, let's recap. Zubiri defines reality as formalized content, and that formalized content is a physical network of physical things connected to each other. Reality's formalization engages all of our senses, from touch and taste to sense of direction or towards. And yes, according to Zubiri, senses like direction are indeed physical. All senses are physical. There is no gap between senses traditionally associated with material and mental realms. For classical philosophy, the act of intelligizing was a spiritual one, and it reached for truth, but that is not the case for Zubiri. Just as the physical process of smelling, which belongs to the nose, produces smell, the process of physically thinking, which belongs to the intellect, produces truth. Or perhaps more accurately, just as sweat is the epidermic actualization of exercise, truth is the intellective actualization of the real. Just as the skin produces sweat when we exercise our muscles, the intellect produces truth when we exercise our intelligence. Now, just as each of our senses can respond to different kinds of apprehensions, primordial and ulterior, our intellects too respond to each of these. Recall that primordial apprehensions are reactions to raw stimulation. I prick my finger and I feel pain, pain, pain. It's raw sensation. Now, obviously, our bodies undergo millions of raw sensations every second. When my intellect brings these sensations to my attention, actualizing them, it produces real truth. It is impossible for real truth to err, since it concerns my stimulation, my feelings, in response to things that happen to me. Ulterior apprehensions are all about connecting things we primordially apprehend to each other. The type of ulterior apprehension that makes these connections is called logos. Affirmations of these connections are called judgments. Since ulterior apprehensions involve multiple apprehensions, Zubiri calls the intellect's actualization of ulterior apprehensions dual truth. These can err because they deal with the strength of connections between things and reality. Basically, when a connection between things is strong, our intellect produces truth. When it is weak, it does not. As we mentioned last episode, I see a hooded figure on a sidewalk. I primordially apprehend fear. My instinctive intellection of the fear is true because I did indeed feel fear, a simple primordial apprehension. Now, if I said hooded figure is dangerous, that would be an ulterior apprehension connecting two things, hooded figure and danger, a connection which can change over time. Thus, in one moment, my intellect can produce dual truth, hooded figure is dangerous. But when the hooded figure reveals himself to be a Benedictine monk who offers me a homebrewed IPA, in my intellect, that connection between hooded figure and danger is weakened. Thus, this physical feeling of truth is weakened. I am slipping into error if I continue to affirm that he is dangerous. Let's talk a bit more about how that happens. Dual truth belongs to the logos because it concerns these relationships between things. And these relationships depend on how real things impress themselves upon us. Truth is the actualization of the real by the intellect. For such an actualization to occur, for truth to be produced, the real must impress itself upon us. Just as a real steak impresses itself onto my nose to actualize a sense of deliciousness, a real solution to a math problem impresses itself on my intellect to actualize a sense of truth. Thus, it is accurate to say that just as deliciousness possesses the nose when it is exposed to a real steak, truth possesses the intellect when exposed to a real source of strength for logos. Conversely, when connections are weakened, the intellect is possessed by error. But what are the ways dual truth is produced? This sense of dual truth comes in three forms: authenticity, conformity, and verification. First, there is truth as authenticity. This occurs when we move from raw stimulation to forming concepts about them. Basically, it's the process of intelligizing or truthifying something, which begins with an apprehension of the real and translates that raw stimulation into a concept. This is what etches our raw stimuli into reality. I feel pain of fire, and my intellect actualizes fire is painful, thus producing truth. Because truth as authenticity involves placing the concept into reality, this concerns logos. Second is truth as conformity, which concerns judgment. Once the raw stimulus is etched into reality, we begin making judgments about the concept. Recall that judgments concern things we already apprehended. Maybe it wasn't the fire that caused pain. Maybe it was a stinging nettle I sat in while I sat around the campfire. Thus, whereas truth as authenticity is produced when things are placed into reality, truth as conformity is produced when judgments are made about those prior truths. Finally, there is truth as reason, which is when we attempt to move beyond our field of actualized apprehensions and attempt to explain them. It's the why moment. Now remember that logos only concerns things we've already apprehended. It doesn't generate any new apprehensions. Rather, it deals with connecting existing ones. Thus, truth as reason concerns the second type of ulterior apprehension, reason, which we will cover later in this series. Again, truth is produced when our intellect participates in the actualization of reality. When our intellect struggles to do so, we are in a state of error. When we encounter a math problem that's just too hard, when we are presented with a study that shakes our understanding of a subject, when we begin to question a deeply held belief, our intellect stops producing truth. Or perhaps more accurately, we stop being possessed by truth. When we profess an answer to a problem that doesn't fit into the rest of our conceptualization of reality, when we willingly turn a blind eye to evidence, we become possessed by error. It's a terrible feeling, and I'm sure you've felt it before when you got a bad test score or lost an argument. Recall that the sense of towards is what compels me to connect things to each other. I hold this mug, and my sense of towards compels my intellect to connect mug with heaviness. But these connections do not exhaust the qualities of the thing. If anything, they create more questions. They instill a desire to know what causes this mug to be heavy. And not only does towards instill a desire to know what causes mug to be heavy, but it provides us with a direction to answer that question as well. It doesn't just leave us hanging. Towards impresses our intellect to move in a certain direction. And those possible resolutions to the question are called guesses. And those guesses are a series of might-be's. Maybe it's plastic, maybe it's metal. And the more interactions or simple apprehensions I get with this mug, the more the real content of the mug directs my sense of towards to narrow down which might be my intellect will settle on. Because of this, Zubiri says that primordial apprehensions, which are rooted in the real, produce a directional focus. A directional focus is composed of a direction and a demand for resolution. I'm not satisfied with thinking this mug might be ceramic or might be metallic. I need to know what it is. At the end of this process, there is either a resolution, in which I confidently say that the mug is indeed metallic, or there is what Zubiri calls directional polyvalence, in which case I give up and say, it might be clay, it might be plastic, it might be metal, I don't know. Basically, I give up. Let's take a more serious example. In 1781, William Herschel discovered Uranus. Okay, maybe serious isn't the best word I could have used there. Anyways, along with the discovery of the seventh planet came studies of its features. Many judgments were made about the planet thanks to the ability of the logos to unite qualities with each other. However, with studies of its features came more questions about the planet, which demonstrates how the more answers we have, the more questions arise. More specifically, its orbit was kinda wonky. The odd shape of its orbit obviously showed scientists were missing some information about the unfortunately named planet, as well as the rest of the solar system. This lack of data, which comes from engagement with real content, threw judgments made via the logos into serious question. The lack of explanation of the planet threw scientists into a state of unreality. meaning their prior formalizations of the planet's content were severely weakened. Their sense of towards, specifically the notion that all planetary orbits can be explained by other astronomical bodies, compelled them to look for answers from various might-bes. Perhaps the planet's orbit was weird because it was hit by an asteroid. Perhaps it had something to do with its chemical composition. The more the scientists studied the planet, primordially apprehending it using instruments again and again and again, and connecting those simple primordial apprehensions to existing ulterior apprehensions, they gained a directional focus until, in the early 1840s, they settled on an answer. The weird orbit of Uranus might have been caused by another, even larger planet beyond it. This was confirmed by a final primordial apprehension in 1846, in which the planet Neptune was observed through a telescope based on mathematical calculations of where scientists predicted it might be. At that moment, when their judgment was confirmed by real data, truth was produced by their intellects. Notice, though, how truth was not produced until real data given by real things compelled the scientists to render a definitive judgment. Thus, perhaps it is more accurate to say, just as the pain of a bee stinging possesses the sufferer, the truth of a discovery possessed the observers. This does mean three things. First, you might think that Zubiri says that truth is based on a feeling. It's not really accurate. Truth is intellective actualization, just as sweat is epidermic actualization, or sight is the actualization of your eye. Truth is indeed a physical moment. It means the intellect is at work. It produces truth, just as when your eyes are at work, they produce sight. The production of truth can vary between people. I can have my truth and you can have yours, just as you can see and smell certain things and I see and smell other things. If I grew up in the Saharan desert and you grew up in the Arctic tundra, the way our bodies respond to temperature will be different. Likewise, if I grew up in a heliocentric society and you grew up in a geocentric one, we will likely intelligize or truthify differently. However, just as a 500-degree flame will burn any human skin regardless of their background, an excellent argument will singe itself onto our intellects, thus producing alignment of truths between people. And this alignment of truths is not dependent on whoever more powerfully wills truth. Truth cannot be willed. Truth is our intellective participation in the process of forming reality, which is totally reliant on the content we are provided with. Hit any person with a brick in the face, and that real apprehension will undoubtedly arise the same intellective response, the same truth of, ouch, that hurts. Thus, truth, like reality, is dynamic, but it is at the mercy of the real. Second, it is possible for something to be true in one moment and false in another. When a set of connections in reality snugly fits, the intellect produces truth to indicate that this reality is adequate. And just as we discussed on our episode on judgment, the more judgments we make, the more questions arise. The more questions arise, the more our fragile network of reality is challenged. The more our fragile network of reality is challenged, the more hypotheses can propose alternative explanations. The more alternative hypotheses are proposed, the greater the odds that we are either stubbornly ignoring evidence or insisting on outdated models of problem solving. The more we do this, the more we fall from being possessed by truth into being possessed by error. Thus, adequacy is quick to change, but it does mean that something can be true in one moment and erroneous in another. Or perhaps it means that something can be true in one network of propositions and erroneous in another. For example, if I said that Mars is the first planet from the center of the solar system, it would be true if I used a geocentric model of the universe. But a geocentric model of the universe only gets us so far in astronomy. Thus, clinging on to it would lead into error. Or if I said 1 + 1 = 10, it would be true if I was counting in binary. But counting in binary would get pretty old pretty fast, meaning that it too would produce much error eventually. Thus, some frameworks work better than others. So pretty much every statement we can come up with works within a pre-existing framework at some point. Saying, "I think Tommy stole my lunch" is true if the evidence I have produces truth. But if it is proven otherwise and I stubbornly continue to believe it, then I fall into a state of error. I think it's important to make a distinction here. What a person says and what a person means aren't always the same thing. In particular, when I say something like the world is flat, my meaning is more accurately based on my observations. I believe the world is flat, which is true. This conviction of mine has produced much truth in my personal life. However, if I am shown enough examples to demonstrate that this is not the case, if I am unable to answer the mountains of evidence that show the world is not flat, if I turn a blind eye to all doubts and alternative hypotheses that are raised, then I cease to participate in truth and I participate instead in error. The third potentially uncomfortable thing about truth is that the way we formalize content into reality is subject to change. Unlike Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, or even the rationalists like Descartes, most scientists and philosophers today believe in a dynamic universe. Not only are the laws of physics changing, the way physics worked a microsecond after the Big Bang is different from how they work today, but the way our brains work is changing too. Most scientists agree that we, like all animals, participated in evolution, meaning the way we formalized content at the dawn of humanity is different than we do now. Even today, different cultures formalize content differently than others. People from warmer climates, for example, tend to have higher body temperatures than those from colder ones. People with less exposure to seafood tend to be allergic to it more. Millions of years ago, we used this organ called an appendix to digest raw meat. Today, we don't really use it. Scientists claim that thousands of years from now, we will likely have bigger thumbs, wider eyes, and possibly technology integrated into our biology. Like it or not, but these things will impact our sense organs, which will impact the way we formalize content, which will, in turn, impact truth. If a terrible disease eliminated the eye's capacity to see the color blue, then the statement, "the sky is blue," would cease to be true, since the intellect would cease to formalize it as such. This sometimes makes people uncomfortable because it kinda seems like you know something is true if it feels true. Surprisingly though, this idea of feeling truth captivating the observer and inspiring a sense of fulfillment isn't new. Especially in Platonic philosophy, many classical philosophers believe that what is true is what is beautiful, and it is beauty that captivates the eye of the beholder. In the Catholic tradition, St. Paul says that God's law is written on our hearts, and although we might not have a magical cricket to tell us right from wrong, I am thoroughly convinced that deep in our hearts and minds, we know when we are rejecting reality and thus not participating in truth. Thus, truth is not static, it is not fixed, it is not rigid. It is dynamic, it is fluid, and it is not something we reach for, it is something we participate in. That said, it is not bendable to the human will. It is not a psychological, nor is it a sociological construct, as many philosophers would say. Remember that problems posed by apprehensions and judgments can only be resolved by a reorganization of reality, which depends on situating content that is given to us by the real. Truth might be dynamic, but it is not whatever we want it to be. Truth answers to reality, and reality rests upon the real. Going forward, when I speak about truth, I'll mostly be referencing dual truth, since that is the truth that is produced by the intellection, and our series is about explaining sentient intelligence. Whew. That's enough about truth. Next episode, we will move on and talk about being. Until next time, God bless you.